On October 16, 2025, the world woke up to news that felt like the final chord of a long, complex symphony had been struck. Ace Frehley, the man who had hidden behind silver makeup and cosmic personas for decades, was gone. Social media exploded. Guitar forums crashed. Vintage Les Paul prices skyrocketed overnight. But something strange was happening in the collective grief, something nobody expected. The tributes weren't mourning Space Ace, the mythical character from the 1970s. They were mourning Daniel Frehley, the real man nobody had truly known. In the days following his death, streaming numbers told a story that defied every music industry prediction. New York Groove surged to #1 on rock charts, not for nostalgia, but because a generation of young guitarists who had never seen Kiss live suddenly understood what they'd been missing. YouTube tutorials of Ace's solos from the Space Invader album, his 2014 masterpiece that most Kiss fans never heard, were being watched millions of times. Vintage guitar shops reported that every silver Les Paul custom in existence had been bought within 72 hours. The question everyone was asking: why did Ace Frehley matter more in death than he ever did during his commercial peak? Before we dive deeper into this story, if you're fascinated by the untold stories behind rock legends and want to explore more hidden chapters of music history, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you the real stories, the ones that never made it to the stage. The year was 1973. Four ambitious musicians in New York City were about to change rock and roll forever, though nobody, including them, understood how or why. Paul Stanley wanted theatricality. Gene Simmons wanted dominance. Peter Criss wanted to swing his sticks like a wild animal. And Daniel Frehley, a quiet kid from the Bronx who could barely make eye contact during conversations, just wanted to play his guitar without anyone asking him questions. The makeup wasn't meant to be permanent. In those early rehearsals in a cramped loft on East 23rd Street, the face paint was just another experiment, like the platform boots and the explosive stage props. But something happened when Ace looked in the mirror and saw the silver-faced Space Ace staring back. The anxiety that had plagued him since childhood, the stammering, the social phobia, the feeling of never fitting in, all of it disappeared behind that mask. He wasn't Paul Frehley anymore, the kid whose father called him a dreamer with no future. He was Space Ace, the coolest member of the hottest band in America. What nobody realized, not even Ace himself, was that this mask would become both his salvation and his curse. For the next 9 years, Paul Frehley would slowly disappear, consumed by the character he'd created. Every interview, every photo shoot, every moment in public, Space Ace was there, and Paul was not. The world fell in love with the persona. But personas don't feel pain. They don't struggle with addiction. They don't cry in hotel rooms at 3 in the morning, wondering who they really are. By 1978, Kiss was the biggest rock band on the planet. Their concerts were religious experiences, fire-breathing, blood-spitting, guitar-smashing spectacles that made the Rolling Stones look like a coffee shop acoustic act. But behind the curtain, something was rotting. Gene Simmons was obsessed with branding and merchandise. Paul Stanley was desperate to be seen as the creative force. Peter Criss was drinking himself into oblivion. And Ace was disappearing into a haze of Jack Daniels and pills, trying to numb the cognitive dissonance of being a character instead of a person. Then came the solo albums. In a move that seemed brilliant but would prove catastrophic, Kiss management decided all 4 members would release solo albums on the same day, September 18, 1978. It was a marketing stunt, a flex of commercial power. But nobody expected what happened next. Ace Frehley's album didn't just succeed, it outsold every other Kiss member's work. New York Groove, a cover song that Ace almost didn't record, became a massive hit. Suddenly, the quietest member, the one who never wanted the spotlight, had proven he didn't need Kiss, and that realization terrified everyone, especially Ace himself. There's a night that changed Ace Frehley's life, though most Kiss fans don't know about it. It happened in Albany, New York, in 1982, during what would be one of his final tours with the band. Ace had been drinking since noon, not unusual by that point. His hands were shaking so badly that his guitar tech had to tune his Les Paul for him. When he walked on stage, the lights were so bright they felt like interrogation lamps. 60,000 people were screaming for Space Ace, but Space Ace wasn't there anymore. Only Paul Frehley, drunk and terrified and utterly lost. He made it through 3 songs. Then, during the opening riff of Cold Gin, his fingers slipped, the guitar fell, the music stopped. And in that silence, that horrible, amplified silence in a stadium full of people, Paul Frehley realized something that would haunt him for the next 20 years. He had become a prisoner of his own creation. The booing started slowly, then built to a roar. Paul Stanley shot him a look that could have melted steel. Gene Simmons kept playing, trying to cover the disaster. But Ace just stood there, staring at his guitar on the floor, and for the first time in 9 years, he felt like Paul Frehley again. And Paul Frehley was broken. Backstage after the show, Paul Stanley said 5 words that ended Kiss as Ace knew it. "You're done. Get some help." No anger, no drama. Just a cold, professional assessment delivered by a man in smudged star makeup. That night, Ace made a decision that would define the next chapter of his life. He would leave Kiss. He would remove the mask. And he would try to figure out who Daniel Frehley actually was. But the world wasn't ready to let Space Ace go. The wilderness years. What happened to Ace Frehley between 1982 and 1995 is a story of spectacular failure, profound loss, and slow, agonizing redemption. He formed Frehley's Comet, a band that should have been huge but collapsed under the weight of Ace's addictions and the music industry's obsession with hair metal. His first marriage ended, then his second. The IRS came after him for back taxes. His guitar collection, vintage Les Pauls, rare Gibsons, instruments worth millions, was sold piece by piece to pay debts and legal fees. By 1990, Ace Frehley was playing small clubs in Connecticut, often to crowds of less than 100 people. There are photographs from this period, grainy, sad images of a man in his late 30s, overweight and exhausted, playing a borrowed guitar because he'd sold all his good ones. The silver makeup was long gone. Space Ace was dead. And what remained was just a guy from the Bronx who'd once been famous and was now trying to remember why he'd ever picked up a guitar in the first place. There's a story from this period that Ace told only once, in a radio interview in 2016. It was 1995. He was living in a small apartment, barely making rent, estranged from his children. One night, his daughter came to visit. She was maybe 10 years old, and she brought a box of old Kiss memorabilia she'd found in her mother's attic. Posters, action figures, vinyl records. She spread them out on the floor and asked him, "Dad, were you really Space Ace?" Ace said he looked at those relics, the silver-faced action figure, the Alive 2 album cover, the concert poster from Madison Square Garden 1977, and felt nothing. No pride, no nostalgia, just a profound emptiness. He told his daughter, That wasn't me. That was someone else. She looked confused. Then she asked the question that changed everything. Then who are you? Ace couldn't answer. But that night, after his daughter left, he picked up an acoustic guitar for the first time in years and started playing. Not Cold Gin or Shock Me or any Kiss song. Just blues progressions, simple 3-chord patterns. The stuff he'd learned as a teenager before fame and makeup and personas. And somewhere in those basic chords, Paul Frehley started to remember who he was. The late 1990s brought an unexpected development. Kiss announced a reunion tour. Original makeup, original members. Gene, Paul, Ace, and Peter, together again for the first time since 1979. The nostalgia machine kicked into overdrive. Tickets sold out in minutes. But Ace approached the reunion with deep ambivalence. He was sober now, barely, but sober. He'd rebuilt some bridges with his family. He was playing guitar again, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And the idea of putting on that silver makeup, of becoming Space Ace again, filled him with dread. The reunion tours were commercially massive but creatively hollow. Ace played the hits with technical precision, but there was no joy in it. He was being paid handsomely to impersonate himself, to resurrect a character he'd spent 15 years trying to kill. Fans couldn't tell the difference. They saw the makeup, heard the solos, and assumed everything was back to normal. But Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons knew. They could see it in Ace's eyes during soundcheck. Space Ace had returned, but Paul Frehley wanted out. By 2002, Ace left Kiss again. This time, there was no drama, no Albany disaster, no bitterness. He just quietly walked away. The music press barely noticed. Kiss replaced him with Tommy Thayer, a guitarist who literally wore Ace's makeup and played his solos note for note. It was the ultimate insult and the ultimate liberation. The character of Space Ace would continue without Paul Frehley, and for the first time in his life, Paul was okay with that. What happened next is the part of the story that mainstream rock journalism completely missed. Between 2002 and 2020, Ace Frehley recorded 4 solo albums that represented the best work of his career. Not commercially. These albums didn't go platinum or spawn hit singles, but artistically, they were everything Ace had been trying to say for 40 years. Anomaly in 2009, Space Invader in 2014, Spaceman in 2018, Origins Volunteer 2 in 2020, each one more mature, more honest, more Paul, and less Ace than the last. Critics were baffled. How was a 70-year-old former Kiss guitarist, decades past his commercial prime, making the most interesting music of his life? But the answer was simple. For the first time, Paul Frehley was playing for himself, not for the character, not for the fans, not for Gene Simmons's approval, just for the love of the instrument. There's a track on Space Invader called The Joker. It's a slow, bluesy number with a guitar tone so warm and personal, it feels like Ace is sitting in your living room. No pyrotechnics, no gimmicks, just a man and his Les Paul having a conversation. The young guitarists who never saw Kiss hears where the story takes its strangest turn. In the mid-2010s, something unexpected started happening on YouTube. Young guitarists, kids in their teens and 20s who weren't even born when Kiss was touring, started posting videos of themselves playing Ace Frehley solos. Not the famous ones from the 1970s. The deep cuts, the solo album tracks, the Space Invader material. These kids weren't interested in Space Ace, the character. They were interested in Paul Frehley, the guitarist. Guitar forums and Reddit threads began analyzing Ace's technique with the kind of reverence usually reserved for Jimi Hendrix or Eric Clapton. They noticed things that 1970s audiences had missed. The way Ace used space in his solos, letting notes breathe instead of cramming in as many as possible. His melodic phrasing, which prioritized emotion over technical showmanship. His tone, that thick, warm, slightly fuzzy sound that came from Les Pauls plugged into cranked Marshall amps with just a touch of wah pedal. Guitarists like Eddie Van Halen, Slash, and Dimebag Darrell had always cited Ace as an influence, but their fan bases assumed they were being polite or nostalgic. Now, with the benefit of distance and YouTube's democratization of music education, a new generation was discovering that Ace Frehley was a legitimately innovative guitarist who'd been overshadowed by his own cartoon persona. In 2016, a music theory YouTuber named Adam Neely posted a 20-minute video analyzing the solo from Shock Me, a song Ace wrote in 1977 about being electrocuted on stage. Neely broke down the harmonic structure, the rhythmic phrasing, the unconventional note choices, and concluded that Ace was wildly underrated, possibly because people couldn't get past the makeup. The video went viral. Within weeks, Shock Me was trending on Spotify. When Ace Frehley died on October 16, 2025, the outpouring of grief was global and immediate. But it wasn't the grief of a typical rock star funeral. There were no public memorials, no televised tributes. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley released brief, respectful statements. Peter Criss, struggling with his own health issues, said nothing publicly. The spectacle that had defined Kiss for 50 years was notably absent. But on the internet, something extraordinary was happening. Within hours of the announcement on that October morning, every streaming service saw a massive surge in Ace Frehley plays. Not Rock and Roll All Night or Detroit Rock City, the Kiss hits, but Ace's solo work. New York Groove hit #1 on iTunes Rock Chart. Shock Me trended on TikTok, where young guitarists were posting tribute videos. The Space Invader album, which had barely registered commercially in 2014, was suddenly the most streamed rock album on Spotify. Music journalists scrambled to understand what was happening. Why was Ace Frehley, a guitarist most people associated with 1970s nostalgia, suddenly relevant to a generation born in the 2000s? The answer lay in a shift that had been happening quietly for years. Younger music fans, raised on the internet's infinite archive, didn't experience rock history chronologically. They didn't care about commercial peaks or cultural moments. They cared about authenticity and skill. And when you stripped away the makeup, the pyrotechnics, the mythology of Kiss, what remained was Daniel Frehley, a world-class guitarist who'd spent 50 years trying to be heard over the noise of his own fame. In the weeks following that October 16th morning, guitar teachers across the world reported something unusual. Students were requesting to learn Ace Frehley solos instead of the usual Eddie Van Halen and Jimi Hendrix standards. When asked why, the answers were remarkably consistent. His solos feel like conversations. He doesn't show off. You can hear his emotion in every note. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Ace Frehley's post-mortem legacy is how it vindicated his life's struggle. For decades, Ace fought against the persona of Space Ace. He left Kiss twice. He made solo albums that deliberately avoided theatrical gimmicks. He gave interviews where he seemed uncomfortable, even prickly, when people asked about the makeup and the stage shows. He wanted to be known as a guitarist, not a character. For decades, he lost that fight. Fans wanted Space Ace. Record labels wanted Space Ace. Even Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley wanted Space Ace, so much that they replaced him with a literal impersonator. The real Paul Frehley was an inconvenience, a difficult artist who didn't fit the narrative. But in death, something shifted. The mask finally fell away, and people saw what had been there all along. The tributes that flooded social media weren't about Space Ace's antics or Kiss's spectacle. They were about a guitarist who made people feel something. About solos that students wanted to learn, not because they were flashy, but because they were true. There's a photograph that circulated widely after Ace's death in October 2025. It's from the early 1980s, backstage at a Kiss concert. Ace is sitting alone in a corner, still in his silver makeup, but he's removed his costume down to a t-shirt. He's holding his Les Paul, playing it acoustically. You can tell because there are no cables attached. No one is watching him. The photo is blurry, clearly taken from a distance. He looks peaceful, lost in the music, in a moment when Space Ace wasn't performing and Paul Frehley could just play. That photograph became a meme, shared by guitarists with captions like, "This is what it's really about," and "When the show is over but the music isn't." There's a quote from one of Ace Frehley's final interviews, given just months before his death in October 2025, that seems to sum up his entire complicated relationship with fame and artistry. The interviewer asked him, "If you could go back and do it all differently, would you?" Ace thought for a moment, then smiled, a genuine smile, not the cocky Space Ace smirk, and said, "No. Because if I did it differently, I wouldn't have ended up here. And here's the first place I've ever felt like myself." He was 74 years old when he said that. More than 50 years since he'd first picked up a guitar in his family's Bronx apartment. More than 40 years since he'd put on silver makeup and become Space Ace. And finally, near the end of his life, Paul Daniel Frehley had figured out who he was. Not a character, not a persona, just a guy from the Bronx who loved playing guitar and somehow convinced the world to listen. When Ace died that October morning, a music journalist wrote, "Rock and roll lost one of its most underappreciated innovators." Another wrote, "The man behind Space Ace was always more interesting than the mask." But perhaps the most accurate assessment came from a Reddit comment that got 50,000 upvotes. Ace Frehley taught us that you don't have to be the loudest or the flashiest to be the best. You just have to mean it. In the end, legacy isn't about platinum records or sold-out stadiums or how many action figures were made in your image. Legacy is about influence, about the music students who want to learn your solos, the artists who incorporate your style, the listeners who feel something real when they hear your work. By that measure, Ace Frehley's legacy after his death on October 16, 2025, was stronger than it had ever been during his lifetime. The mask is gone. The man remains. And the music, finally, is being heard the way it was always meant to be heard. Without distraction, without spectacle, without Space Ace getting in the way. Just Paul Frehley, his Les Paul, and the truth he spent a lifetime trying to play. That's why Ace Frehley matters more today than he did in the 1970s. Because we're finally listening to what he was actually saying.